What is your book about?
Well, my book, which is called A Parent-Partner Status for American Family Law, is an argument that the government should create a new legal status that would govern the relationship of two people who have a child in common. The government would impose a series of core legal obligations on the parents that would obligate them to each other in various ways, and this would constitute the status. This particular status would exist whether the parents are married or unmarried, whether or not they are in a romantic relationship at the time or not. It would exist throughout the child's minority until the child turned 18 years old. And the idea is that this particular status would create a new social role in society of parent-partner. The status itself would not obligate the government or third parties in any way to the parent partners, or would it obligate the parent partners in any way to the government or third parties. These would just be a series of obligations between the parents who have a child in common.
So why did you write this book?
I wrote this book because family demographics have really changed over time, and I don't think the law has kept up. Today, many children are born into non-marital families, and the parents of those children really don't have any legal structure supporting them and encouraging them in a way to stay together and to have a supportive relationship that will benefit their children. Many children today see their parents' relationships break up, so 40% of marital parents eventually divorce. A higher percentage of non-marital parents end up breaking up. And there's no legal structure there either for parents after their relationships break up to really encourage them to be doing what's best for their children. I also think that there's quite a bit of kind of risky or unwise, perhaps, sexual behavior where people are either risking reproduction or consciously reproducing with people that they wouldn't, for example, marry, that they don't know or don't think would necessarily be a good long-term partner for them. And so because of this, I thought society could probably do better in encouraging people to partner and have the sorts of relationships that would really do children good over the long term. I also thought that there was quite a bit of unfairness and harm that was occurring simply because of the interdependencies that can be created by having a child with someone else, and that the law really wasn't addressing a lot of those unfair or harmful situations. So I thought the law could do a better job at that. I also thought it was really quite unfair when I stopped and thought about it that so many children had no legal structure at all governing their parents' relationship. And it was really pure luck whether or not a child was going to be born into a relationship that had a legal structure that encouraged the parents to kind of, be a solid team or didn't. There were no social norms for those children for how their parents should be living their life, and in terms of their relationship and doing what they needed to do to support their children. And also, there was not even a name for some of those relationships. So, for example, two people who have a child in common could be spouses, but they may not be spouses. And if they're not spouses, what do we call them in society? They are maybe co-parents if their romantic relationship is broken up, but the co-parent label really refers just to a subset of the relationship and not the entire relationship in any event. And I think we want everyone to think of two people who have a child in common as family and apply some social norms that will support that relationship.
What kind of law guide human behavior?
So the law would, or the status would guide human behavior just like really any law does. So for example, if the status had a legal obligation that parents were to disclose certain information to each other before they entered a prenuptial agreement, because society thought, okay, here are two people who should trust each other, have confidence in what they say, and we're going to impose a higher level of disclosure between them when they enter something like a prenuptial agreement, then someone who wanted their prenuptial agreement to be enforceable down the road would simply comply with what the law required and would do what the law required. So in that way, the status would not really differ from other laws. What makes the status, I think, a little bit unique is that the status, by being kind of an amalgamation of many legal obligations, would create a social role. And social roles really have a great power to influence our behavior. So the person who kind of elaborated on this at great length was Sheldon Stryker, a sociologist And he explained that really we define, perform, and prioritize our social roles by how others view us and view those particular social roles. So if others knew there was a parent-partner status and a parent-partner role and what that involved, then we would respond accordingly. And you can see this really in how people respond to the social role of spouse. So people know, for instance, that spouses aren't supposed to cheat. Now that's embodied in the law, but most people don't know that that's even embodied in the law. Most people know that they're not supposed to cheat if they're a spouse because of the social expectations and their friend who says, don't flirt with the waitress, you're married, or the person who sees their wedding ring. The person who sees that isn't going to flirt with that person. So we really have ways of shaping behavior that are influenced by the law, but that aren't directly dependent upon the law. And so I think that's what this new status would do. And I think the status would try to convey the idea that, the relationship's supposed to be a supportive one, a loving one, not necessarily a romantically loving one, but a loving one in the family sense. And people would then act accordingly.
Shouldn't we just encourage more people to get married?
I don't think encouraging more people to get married will actually solve the problems that I've identified. The marriage rates have fallen over the last 50 years pretty dramatically, and no one has really figured out how to turn that around, although people have tried. It's a little bit speculative why the marriage rates have fallen. It could be, and I think the answer is really couple by couple, but for some people I think the marriage rate has fallen and marriage is not so attractive because of the gender roles historically associated with the institution. That is, cohabitation and non-marriage is seen as a more equal arrangement between the parties. I also think that some people see marriage as something that you enter into only when you have a certain level of economic security, which many people don't have and frankly may never achieve. I also think that marriage no longer is a prerequisite to many of the things that used to be a prerequisite for. So with sexual kind of freedom in our country, you don't have to be married to have a sexual relationship anymore. So it's lost a lot of its function as well. I also think that even if we could restore the marriage rates, marriage itself is not sufficient to do what I think we need to do. And that's because if you look at the divorce rate, you realize that marriage doesn't necessarily itself set couples on this path to make sure they're always working as a team for the benefit of their children. So divorce rates are still, although they're decreasing, they're still quite high, especially among certain socioeconomic classes. And really, when people get married, they're unable, I think, when they have a child, then to identify any difference that child makes to the legal relationship. And so consequently, I don't think marriage itself does the work that we need the law to do in creating any sort of social role. I also think that marriage, while a very important institution, would not be undermined in any way by the status. That is, the status really does only create legal obligations between the parents themselves and doesn't require the government to give any sort of benefits, for example, to the couple. So really all the reasons why, those thousands of benefits we heard about in the same-sex marriage context that people have access to when they get married, those still will exist and will be an incentive for people to marry if that's the right institution for them.
Do you propose specific obligations?
I do propose specific obligations in the book. Before I mention those, let me just preface it with a couple comments. First of all, while the obligations I think are really important, and they do take up a third of the book, I want to be clear that I think it would be a major achievement if there were some sort of social consensus about the need for a parent-partner status. I think the legal obligations are the details and something that we can work through together and kind of debate, but we first, I think, need agreement that a status would be appropriate and useful. I guess the second point I want to make before I say what the obligations are is that I was kind of guided in choosing the obligations by thinking about what sort of norms I wanted to convey through the obligations. And really what I did was looked at those norms and those qualities that make people successful co-parents both through the transition to parenthood and resilient and able to co-parent after the breakup of the romantic relationship. And the thought was those are the norms that really should be guiding our selection of legal obligations. So the norms that I identified are parent partners should be flexible, they should be fond of each other, they should accept each other's qualities that the other person won't change. They should act together on major co-parenting challenges, and they should be empathetic towards each other. With that background, I tried to select obligations that would really kind of spark a conversation. I chose 2 that had to do with people's physical integrity. I chose 2 that had to do with economic issues, and I chose 1 that had to do with the health of the parent partnership itself. So the first one would be a duty to aid a parent partner. That is, parent would have an obligation to render reasonable assistance if the other parent partner was physically imperiled. So if one parent were lying in the street and needed 911 called and the other parent had a cell phone, that parent would have the obligation to do that. And you can see how I think that would convey the right norms, that we're supposed to support each other and we're supposed to be empathetic. When someone's in the street dying, you should call 911. The second legal obligation that I thought should exist would be an obligation to not physically or psychologically abuse the other parent. And so I recommend a series of changes to the restraining order statutes that I think would be appropriate for parent partners, and 1 change to the criminal law. The third obligation I suggest is an obligation of relationship work, which would require each party to engage in either some sort of educational program or counseling, both at the transition to parenthood and at the demise of the romantic relationship. And I want to be clear that the remedy for not complying with this obligation, if a parent went into court to try to enforce it, would be actually the resistant parent would have to attend an informational session on the benefits of doing these things. The third legal obligation would be an obligation related to contracting, so to act fairly and honestly in contracting about aspects of the family relationship. So for example, if the parties entered a premarital agreement or a cohabitation agreement, there would be certain obligations that are explained in the book. The fifth obligation is the obligation to give, care, or share, which is an obligation to really not let one person do an unfairly disproportionate amount of the caregiving. And if one party did an unfairly disproportionate amount of that caregiving, for example, because the other party just abandoned the party, then that party would have a right to compensation. So those are the 5 obligations that I propose, and hopefully they will trigger a conversation.